uh, their behavior because they had free will. They had the ability to choose the right path or the wrong path, and they chose the wrong path. They now have to pay the price for it. They now have to accept their responsibility. Again, when we talk about retribution, we're talking about support that goes millennia down the line. This is nothing new. This is something that has been built through time. To clarify, and when someone thinks about retribution, one should think about culpability and justice. We're trying to blame someone. We're trying to harm an individual who has made the choice to harm someone else. We're not harming the person who harmed someone else by accident. These are people who actually thought about it ahead of time. And only people who are culpable, only people who thought about it, should be held accountable. And they will deserve the punishment they receive. Of course, again, this is more of the theoretical aspect of criminal law, and we won't focus very much on this. We're talking about abstract justice. We're not talking about a criminal code. We're not talking about someone who can walk through the streets and say, I know if I did this, it's a crime. I know if I don't do this, it's a crime. Rather, you're talking more about this vague notion of good and evil that everyone just magically becomes instilled with or is taught through their parents. So one of the negative aspects when we think about retribution is in fact how to take that arbitrary or that amorphous idea and put it into something concrete that can be used to create laws. Of course, retribution seems barbaric, and that's a criticism of retribution. And there are some issues, especially nowadays, where even if someone is not directly culpable for something, let's say something that we wouldn't necessarily, a parking ticket. And that's not something we would consider to be a moral wrong, a moral imperative that deserves you to hate another for spending 2 more minutes in that parking spot than they were supposed to. That's not quite what we think of when we think about those who deserve to have retribution sought. Now let's switch to prevention. The other side of the punishment coin. With prevention, we're actually looking forward to try to prevent future crimes. Versus retribution, where we're really looking backwards and saying, well, they did this in the past, so therefore here's the hammer. We're going to pound it on them and make sure they don't do it in the future. Versus prevention, where we're saying, this is what they did in the past, rather than a hammer, we're going to try to fix them to prevent this from happening again. And the focus is on looking forward versus the focus being on looking back. There are 4 types. There's general and specific or special deterrence. there's incapacitation, and there's rehabilitation. As far as general deterrence, we're talking about making an example. You know, chopping off someone's head and putting it on a stake outside of a castle. That's what happens if you steal from the king. General deterrent. Okay, I don't want my head up on a stick, so I won't steal from the king. That assumes that people are understanding the purpose behind the deterrent, and it also assumes that people act rationally. The deterrence theory has what's called the principle of utility, and that is, don't go stick someone's head on a stake for stealing. If you could do it, if you could deter with cutting off a finger, burning alive, talking about the medieval times, we're trying to only put as much deterrent as is necessary to prevent the crime from happening. You don't want to go overboard. Of course, people aren't rational. People are also very forgetful of things pretty quickly. People, in an irrational way, can rationalize their way out of a situation, differentiate their own actions from others. So there are definitely heavy criticisms for the deterrence theory. Of course, it can create the idea that, you know, I'm going to make an example of you. Even though you only did a small bit of this crime, and you yourself may be rehabilitated, I'm going to make an example of you, and I'm going to do something heinous that would prevent others from trying to do what you did. So that's another criticism. Versus a special deterrent, where you don't want to make an example of the person for others, but rather you're trying to deter that criminal. You're trying to deter that criminal from committing any more crimes in the future. Incapacitation. Think drugs, brain surgery, even some genital mutilation, depending on the type of crime. You're basically preventing the person from doing the crime again. You're changing who they are by somehow physically preventing them from doing it again. So if the person is a rapist, certain parts of that person will get cut off so that he no longer feels the sexual urges to commit rape, or has the testosterone. A person steals a lot, lobotomy. He doesn't have an executive center of his brain, he won't be able to think through to actually commit the crime. drugs, you know, the person is so out of it, he can't put two thoughts together to go and commit a crime. Or he was so depressed that's why he committed a crime, so I'm just going to feed him tons of antidepressants. I think just, of course, the one that we still do, we don't really do the other ones, death. We're not going to cut your leg off, we're not going to cut out some of your brain, we're not going to lob off any precious part of you, we're just going to kill you. And that way, you'll never commit a crime again. Some states have the death penalty, other states do not, but the death penalty is still provided for as a means of incapacitation. Of course, with incapacitation, there are obvious criticisms. You have generally some moral issue with taking someone's life, or somehow providing that they are no longer the same person. Now we'll go to rehabilitation. Rehabilitation, on the other hand, is changing the personality of the individual in order to get that person not to commit a crime again. And by the way, with incapacitation, you do have incarceration as well, aside from death, because if the person isn't physically able to reach their victims, his or her victim, then the crime will be prevented. With the medical model of criminal law, the medical model states that individual criminals are sick, they have a disease. You wouldn't punish someone for being slow in class if you recognize that they are just handicapped, a little bit slower to understanding certain materials, maybe quicker at understanding other materials. You wouldn't punish that person, you would teach that person to develop the skills that they're good at and try to develop as much skills that they're not good at. You're going to try to change their personality in a bit, not to have themselves view themselves as a handicap. With rehabilitation, you're doing the same thing. You're telling the criminal that, you know, what you have in your mind is not acceptable with society, so we're going to use therapy and other methods to try to rehabilitate the criminal so that it no longer is a threat. Of course, like any psychological issue, it takes a while to do. Rehabilitation assumes that the person has the ability to take control of himself or herself and make themselves a better person. That they're determined to do that. And of course, with that, the same assumption is that you can't really blame the offender, which offends a lot of people, especially the victims of crimes. You want to blame someone, so by the standards under rehabilitation, one of the assumptions kind of goes against the grain, what's natural for us to do. Of course, criticisms that come around with rehabilitation is, doesn't work.